And welcome to our last PC build for 2020, where we feature a Ryzen 9 3950X and an RTX 3070. This build primarily is meant for 3D rendering and 3D work in general, but it is still a very good gaming machine if you're looking into that, with or without ray tracing. Now let's get to building and then to testing, so let's go ahead and dive right in. Before we continue, I just want to remind you that we have a Twitch channel where we stream every Friday and Saturday from 8 p.m. and to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, so why not go ahead and drop a follow? And also don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and also make sure to check out the merch store. There's plenty of black and white sweetness to choose from up there, so go ahead and check that out. And then make sure to take a look at the podcast as well, as the podcast always goes live every Wednesday and Sunday. And with that said, enough rambling, let us get straight into the video. I'm going to talk about the parts individually and explain why we went with all of these parts. We went for the Ryzen 9 3950X because we simply couldn't find a 5950X anywhere, at least not at MSRP, but this is still a very capable processor and it's got 16 cores and 32 threads, making this an absolute beast. It should handle multi-threaded workloads very well in gaming alike, but this was the best choice within our budget. And to cool the CPU, we have this Noctua 140mm air cooler. This is an air cooler, and while this is definitely the least appealing air cooler I've seen for any build, what matters really is how it performs, and this is a very quiet fan, which is important if you need to leave renders running overnight and catch a little bit of sleep. So yeah, that's essentially why we went for this cooler instead, even though we aren't sacrificing aesthetics as a result. Next up is going to be the motherboard, and we actually went for the Asus TUF Gaming X570 Pro. We chose this motherboard because of its multiple NVMe slots so we can upgrade it in the future, and its overclocking capabilities too. It's really as simple as that for us when it comes to motherboards, so this one will work just fine, to be completely honest. Next is going to be the RAM, and we actually went for 2 sticks of 32 gigs for a total of 64 gigs. Eventually we want to add more RAM to go up to 128 gigs, so we figured that it would be best to just go with 2 sticks for now and to keep the budget as low as possible, but still get a good amount of RAM for our needs and still have some more GBs, of course. And I think that 64 gigs is a very good number that might not even get used entirely, but it is good to have that amount of headroom nonetheless, when it comes to 3D work, of course. Next is going to be the GPU, and we were lucky enough to get our hands on an RTX 3070 Founders Edition, and this is a very beautiful card that, while it doesn't light up at all, it does still look very clean and is a fantastic performer for the price if you can get it at MSRP, that is. That is likely not to happen anytime soon though, but we stuck with this one not just because we wanted to keep the budget as low as we can, but because we couldn't find an RTX 3080 at all, and a 3090 is completely out of the question budget-wise, but this will certainly do for now. And next is going to be the power supply. This is a 750 watt power supply from EVGA. This is a fully modular power supply that will certainly suffice for now. It's got everything that we need and definitely enough power to sustain this system, even at much higher loads, without a doubt. And for storage, we settled on a 6TB Western Digital drive for most of our dump storage like games and footage, and just about anything that isn't really all that important per se, but this will give us enough security to make sure that we have enough storage for a very long time. But the boot drive is going to be this NVMe SSD from Accelerate Gaming. This is a 2TB drive that is quite fast and will fit just fine into this motherboard. We picked it for the storage count since the C drive does clog up very quickly if you just have, for example, 240 gigs, which is usually standard for a lot of these builds, at least what I've done in the past. So something like that is going to be very useful, and this is going to give us a lot of headroom here when it comes to the C drive. And lastly, there's the Thermaltake mid-tower case that we will put everything inside of. It's got 3 RGB fans up front and a single fan around the back. It's metal, and it's got a tempered glass side panel. It's nice and pretty. And now it's time for us to get building, and as always, we want to start by opening up the case from both sides so that we don't have to deal with space issues later if we have to route any cables around. From opening the side panel, we can start by first inserting the I/O shield on the back, which is essentially just a matter of popping it in, just like so. And then from here, we can actually just place the motherboard inside and align it with the I/O shield to make sure that they are indeed properly aligned and that the ports will actually stick out as they should from the motherboard. You know, like just to make sure that everything here is correct, of course. And once we've verified the alignment, we just screw down the motherboard until it's safely secured onto the case. Then this is when we start to remove the retention clip to loosen it and align the CPU with the little arrow on both units. And then we gently place it down and give it a little wiggle to make sure that it is properly seated. Then we just close the retention arm and the CPU will stay where it is. For the RAM, we are going to take the two furthest slots, and since it's only 2 sticks, we're going to leave one slot in between the two empty so that we can actually take advantage of something like dual channel, which is something that can come in handy and there's no reason why we wouldn't want to use it. So just align the RAM to insert it, and then you should hear a click from there, and that's how you know that you've installed it correctly. And now we want to install the CPU cooler, and we have to do some measurements here. This cooler does not fit inside of this case as is, it's just too big. So if we were going to work with it, we had to get a little ghetto and actually sand down a part of the top of the fan, since it's just plastic, that would fit almost perfectly flush with our case, though there's no footage of that since it was kind of embarrassing to find this out so late. So we just went ahead and proceeded to install the brackets for the cooler first, and before we left the cooler on the CPU permanently, we added a little bit of thermal paste to the CPU. Then we put the cooler down without the fan first, since it's more comfortable to install it that way, and we just went ahead and screwed it down just like so. And then once it's all in, just clip on the fan, and it should all be good to go from there, and your CPU should be fully installed. And now I'm going to be going to the other side of the case to install the hard drive first. This case has 2 hard drive slots, so we just took one out and installed the hard drive like so. Slide that in, and now that we're here, we figured that we would work on installing the power supply. But before putting it in, we should definitely install the cables that we know we're going to be needing first. Otherwise, it'll be very uncomfortable to do afterwards, since it'll just be really annoying reaching for them and reaching for the slots after the fact, and you really just don't want to have to deal with that once it's already inside. So we take care of that, and then we put in the power supply with the fan facing upwards. Now we go back to the left side of the case and remove one of the shields for the NVMe drives, which is going to be around the motherboard. We just had to slot in a 2 terabyte drive in there and screw them both down together to secure them, and that's essentially how that part gets done. Now we don't really have much left from here, so we just remove the brackets around the back where the GPU is going to align, and then once we get that out, we just unclick the PCIe slot and insert the GPU until we hear a small little click, and then we can go ahead and just screw it down from the side, and we should be good to go from there. Now once all of this is in, we actually get to start plugging all of the cables in, which is definitely the most tedious part, I would argue, besides installing the CPU cooler, of course. But cable management is always a hassle, so here's a time lapse for that instead. Now let's go. And now we finally get to testing some games. All of these tests are going to be done in 4K, starting with Flight Simulator. On high settings in 4K, it averages at around 45 frames per second, which is honestly quite impressive considering how utterly demanding this game is. Seems like the CPU and GPU are a great combination here, but it does use up a lot of resources. Either way, I would definitely consider this more than playable if anything, even if you won't get that magic 60 FPS number that most people would be looking for with those settings per se, but you do get some very nice visuals nonetheless, and I guess it depends on what kind of gamer you are. Next is Final Fantasy 15, the first game to deliver on any RTX features of this list, but only deep learning super sampling for that matter, and no actual ray tracing, which can only be activated in 4K, by the way, and that just goes for deep learning super sampling. So at max settings in 4K and with DLSS turned on, we get somewhere around 60 frames per second with some drops here and there, and it's not really like super stable 60 FPS, but it is still a very solid gaming experience with just about no stutters after everything loads up. This game looks absolutely beautiful this way, and I feel safe saying that this is probably the way you want to play this game. And now here we ran a benchmarking tool for Shadow of the Tomb Raider with ray trace shadows and deep learning super sampling on, with pretty much high to max settings on everything. Ray trace shadows did cause the game to go around a playable 55 frames per second on average, and lowering the shadows quality only gives it a few more frames really, but there were times where we actually got around 70 frames per second, so it does depend on what you're doing. The frame rate isn't super consistent, but it is very much playable at these settings. And then we went ahead and tested Cyberpunk 2077, of course, and we were pleasantly surprised here. In mostly maxed out settings with ray tracing turned on all fronts and deep learning super sampling at 4K, this game does take up a lot of resources, but it does at least work very well and is beyond playable at around 55 to 70 frames per second average, which seems like a pretty wide gap in frame rate, but it may not be noticeable by a lot of people. Honestly, performance seems fine to me here, and ray tracing does add some nice lighting and shadows that are very enjoyable to look at, not gonna lie. So yeah, those are the numbers that you should be expecting if you're going to have ray tracing on, but obviously the numbers are going to be higher if you don't. And then we tried another benchmarking tool that is specific to ray tracing with 3D Mark. Frame rates were actually quite high in 4K, and reflections were very much noticeable, easily surpassing 60 frames per second in this benchmark with quite a lot going on, and it would often go considerably higher as well. So this was a nice ego boost for sure. And finally, now, when it comes to render times in Maya, there has been a dramatic improvement from our last rig with a 1050 Ti and a Ryzen 1300X. A single highly detailed frame with a lot of lighting effects rendered in about 6 minutes, which is a big upgrade from the 40 plus minutes that we got before with some possible crashes in between. Now, if you want to push the system even further, then we would get about 12 minutes or so per frame, and that's honestly really pushing the system here. Timeline performance, or just performance while working in Maya, is very stable, by the way, and the rendering process is very stable too, with only one crash to speak of. This is going to be very impressive. And in conclusion, this is a really great build, but it's definitely not cheap. This came at around $2,600 to $2,700, which is one of the most expensive builds I've ever worked on. However, at this budget, you do get very good performance in games. You don't need ray tracing to get amazing graphics, and honestly, you definitely get a noticeably higher frame rate with each game we tested, but this system can handle ray trace games quite well as it is, and if you need a workstation that kind of still might break the bank a little bit, you know, but doesn't necessarily go way far beyond what most people might be looking for if they're looking to do actual 3D work, then this is going to be a great way to go for sure. Highly recommended in that sense. And with that said, I'm going to have all of these parts listed down below as affiliate links, so if you end up using any of those links, it does help out the channel quite a bit. And also, don't forget that we offer a service through Abunda, which essentially allows you to finance any of these parts as they are, and it doesn't require a credit card from you at all. It is just a very simple way of financing things, and especially, you know, if you're going for a pretty expensive build, maybe you might want to finance a couple of things here and there. So I am going to leave abundant links to all of these things so that you can choose which ones you want to finance and so on and so forth. If you use those links, that would help with the channel quite a bit too. So thank you very much there. And also do make sure to stop by the Tech Summit podcast, as we do tend to post every week. And with that said, we also have a Twitch channel where we like to stream every Friday and Saturday from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern time. And yeah, more social media stuff over here. You're going to find my Instagram and my Twitter. But with that said, this has been Francisco from Tech Summit. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be seeing you all later. Enjoy.